You are listening to a transmission that was never intended to be public. Some events were recorded, others were remembered, a few were quietly forgotten. Tonight, we return to one of them. On certain nights, entire cities become witnesses, not to disasters, not to celebrations, but to moments that do not fit easily into memory. March 13th, 1997 was one of those nights. Across the state of Arizona, from small desert towns to the outer edges of Phoenix, people stepped outside for ordinary reasons: to walk a dog, to smoke, to take out the trash, to stand in the warm darkness before going to bed. And then, many of them looked up. At first there was no urgency, no sense that history was unfolding, only the quiet recognition that something in the sky was moving in a way they could not immediately understand. It was not fast. It made no sound. It did not behave like an aircraft attempting to arrive somewhere. Instead, it seemed to pass, deliberately. Witnesses would later struggle to describe what they had seen, not because they lacked imagination, but because imagination usually relies on comparison. Planes sound like planes. Helicopters announce themselves. Satellites drift with distant indifference. This was something else, a formation of lights, structured, impossibly wide, moving slowly enough that entire neighborhoods had time to gather in silence and watch it continue south. In the years that followed, the event would be debated, explained, dismissed, rediscovered, and quietly remembered. But on that night, before explanations began, there was only a shared perception. Thousands of people looking upward, and the uneasy feeling that the sky itself had briefly stopped following familiar rules. 1990s, Arizona was changing. Phoenix was expanding outward into the desert at a pace that felt both ambitious and fragile. New housing developments appeared where open land had existed only months before. Highways stretched deeper into dry terrain. Streetlights carved geometric patterns into darkness that had once been uninterrupted. Despite the growth, the night sky remained unusually clear. Far from coastal humidity and heavy industry, much of the region still offered something increasingly rare in modern cities: visibility. Stars did not merely decorate the sky, they dominated it. For many residents, looking upward was not an unusual habit. Astronomy clubs were active. Commercial pilots routinely described Arizona airspace as some of the most visually predictable in the United States. Military aircraft were also a familiar presence, particularly near training ranges to the west. This combination created an environment shaped by expectation. People knew what aircraft looked like. They understood the sound of distant engines carried across dry air. They recognized flight paths, contrails, navigation lights. The sky was not mysterious. It was observed. On the evening of March 13th, conditions were calm. Winds were light. Cloud cover was minimal. Temperatures had begun their gradual descent after sunset. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested disruption. And yet, earlier that night, reports had already begun to move quietly southward through the state, from small communities near the Nevada border, to towns along interstate corridors, to scattered observers positioned far enough apart that their experiences could not easily influence one another. Each report described a similar impression: not a flash, not a meteor, not an isolated aircraft, but something structured, something moving with intention. By the time the lights approached the northern outskirts of Phoenix, the conditions were almost ideal for collective observation. Suburban streets were active, restaurants were closing, backyard conversations were still unfolding beneath an open sky. What followed would not be a fleeting anomaly seen by a single witness. It would become a progression, measured not in seconds, but in minutes. A slow passage across one of the fastest-growing cities in America. For many residents, the experience began as a private moment. A man standing in his driveway after work noticed lights approaching from the north. They were arranged in a wide formation, too wide, he would later say, to belong to any single aircraft he had ever seen. At first he assumed distance was distorting his perception, but as the lights continued forward, maintaining their spacing with unusual precision, he realized the structure itself was enormous. He called for his wife to come outside. On the opposite side of the city, a group of teenagers lying on the hood of a parked car watched the same formation move slowly across the sky. They expected noise, the rising whine of engines, the rhythmic chopping of helicopter blades, but the air remained undisturbed. One of them later described the silence as the most unsettling detail. Not dramatic silence, not cinematic silence, simply the absence of a sound that should have been there. Further west, a retired police officer observed the lights pass directly overhead. He would later estimate that the object, or formation, appeared to block out portions of the star field as it moved. Not completely, but enough to create the impression of mass, a moving absence. Several witnesses independently reported the same sensation, that the lights were not separate craft flying in coordination, but part of a single structure. Something connected, something deliberate. Time itself seemed to behave differently during the sighting. People who glanced up for what felt like seconds would later realize they had been watching for minutes. Neighbors emerged from houses. Phone calls were made. Cars were stopped in quiet residential streets. Across the region, observation became collective. Among those who noticed unusual lights that night was actor and licensed pilot Kurt Russell. While flying into the Phoenix area with his son, he reported seeing a formation of lights below his aircraft, a sight he would later mention in an interview years after the event had already entered regional folklore. His account did not resolve the mystery, but it contributed to a growing pattern: different vantage points, different professions, different expectations, yet a similar description. A vast, slow-moving presence crossing the sky with no visible urgency. Witnesses would later disagree on details: color, altitude, exact shape. Memory is rarely precise under unfamiliar conditions, but they agreed on something more fundamental. Whatever moved over Arizona that night did not resemble a routine aerial transit. It felt, observed in return, not in the literal sense of intelligence or intention, but in the quiet psychological recognition that the boundary between watcher and watched had briefly become uncertain. As reports continued to circulate in the days following the sighting, attention gradually moved from neighborhood conversations to official awareness. Local media began collecting testimonies, call-in segments filled with descriptions that were similar enough to be unsettling, yet varied enough to resist simple categorization. For state officials, the situation presented an unfamiliar challenge. There had been no confirmed emergency, no measurable damage, no physical evidence that could be easily displayed at a podium. Only stories, and stories, when shared by thousands, have a way of demanding response. At the time, Arizona's governor was Fife Symington, a former Air Force officer and a public figure accustomed to scrutiny. He initially approached the growing attention surrounding the lights with visible skepticism. In June of that year, 3 months after the event, a press conference was organized. Journalists gathered expecting clarification, perhaps new information, perhaps reassurance grounded in technical detail. Instead, the room was interrupted by theatricality. An aide entered dressed in an alien costume, hands mockingly restrained in handcuffs. The gesture was framed as humor, a way to deflate speculation and signal that the situation did not warrant serious concern. Laughter followed. For many witnesses, the moment did not feel reassuring. It felt like dismissal. Public narrative had begun to diverge from private experience. Years later, long after leaving office, Symington would speak again about the night of March 13th. In interviews, he described personally observing an enormous craft moving silently over the desert, an account markedly different from the tone of that earlier press conference. Memory, reputation, and responsibility had intersected. His revised testimony did not provide technical answers. It did not confirm origin or intent, but it altered the emotional architecture of the event. What had once been treated as spectacle became something more ambiguous, a reminder that official reactions are often shaped not only by what is known, but by what is considered manageable. Between those two boundaries, uncertainty can persist for decades. As the Phoenix lights entered national awareness, explanations began to emerge. Some were immediate, others developed slowly, shaped by investigation, media framing, and the natural human desire to resolve ambiguity. One of the most widely cited explanations involved military training exercises conducted at the Barry M. Goldwater Range, a vast desert area southwest of Phoenix, frequently used for aerial operations. According to official accounts, pilots from the Maryland Air National Guard had released illumination flares during nighttime maneuvers. These flares, suspended beneath small parachutes, are designed to descend gradually, producing intense stationary light visible across large distances. Video footage captured later in the evening appeared consistent with this description. A row of lights hovering above the distant Estrella Mountains slowly faded one by one, as flares would when burning out or dropping below the horizon. For many observers, this explanation was sufficient. It accounted for the stationary lights seen after approximately 10 p.m. It aligned with known military activity. It provided a tangible mechanism that could be demonstrated and understood. Yet the earlier reports presented a more complicated picture. Witnesses who had observed a vast V-shaped formation moving silently across the state described an event occurring hours before the flare drop. Their accounts involved motion rather than suspension, structure rather than isolated points of light. A continuous trajectory tracked from northern Arizona toward Phoenix and beyond. Investigators and journalists attempting to reconstruct the timeline encountered a subtle but consequential difficulty. Two distinct visual phenomena had become compressed into a single public narrative. The stationary lights, explainable within conventional military practice, and the earlier moving formation, less easily categorized. Over time, repetition simplified the story. Headlines referred broadly to the Phoenix Lights, as though a singular object or moment had been documented. Nuance faded, explanations traveled faster than chronology. For some witnesses, this blending created a lasting sense of misrepresentation, not because they rejected the possibility of flares, but because the explanation seemed to address a different experience than the one they remembered. In complex public events, clarity is rarely lost through conspiracy. More often, it dissolves through compression. Multiple observations become one. Multiple timelines become one. And the space between them, where uncertainty lives, becomes harder to see. In the weeks following March 13th, the sky over Arizona returned to its usual patterns. Commercial flights traced predictable routes. Military aircraft continued their training cycles. Sunsets dissolved into familiar constellations. But for many witnesses, the event did not conclude when the lights disappeared. It lingered in conversations that resurfaced months later, in sketches drawn from memory, in small gatherings where people compared impressions, searching for alignment in details that had already begun to soften with time. Some attempted formal documentation. Amateur investigators mapped sighting locations across the state, attempting to reconstruct a coherent trajectory. Local journalists archived interviews that might otherwise have faded into anecdote. Video recordings were duplicated, analyzed, debated, not always with technical expertise, but with quiet determination. No definitive physical trace emerged. No recovered material, no radar data publicly presented in a form that resolved the question. Only testimony, yet testimony has its own longevity. Years later, documentaries revisited the night. Witnesses, now older, often more cautious in their language, continued to describe the same essential impression: scale, silence, deliberateness. Some admitted uncertainty about specific visual features. Memory rarely preserves precision over decades, but the emotional certainty remained intact. They had seen something. Not everyone held the same interpretation. For some, the flare explanation provided closure. For others, the earlier moving formation remained an unresolved anomaly, filed away not as proof of the extraordinary, but as a gap in understanding. The event gradually entered regional folklore, not mythologized in dramatic fashion, rather absorbed into the quiet identity of a place where vast skies invite observation. New residents heard fragments of the story from neighbors. Late-night radio programs revisited the timeline. Occasional anniversary articles briefly returned the lights to public attention before allowing them to recede once more. Unexplained events rarely vanish. They become sediment, layered beneath newer headlines, newer certainties, newer distractions. Still present, still capable of resurfacing when conditions, psychological or cultural, make space for their return. Nearly 3 decades have passed since the lights moved over Arizona. In that time, the modern world has become increasingly convinced of its ability to observe itself. Satellites map the surface of the planet in near real time. Commercial aircraft can be tracked by anyone with a mobile phone. Military sensor networks monitor vast regions of airspace with quiet persistence. The sky, once a domain of speculation, is now widely perceived as catalogued, accounted for, known, and yet uncertainty has not disappeared. It has simply changed its language. Institutions that once avoided public discussion of unidentified aerial events now acknowledge them in measured terms. Data is reviewed, footage is analyzed. Committees are formed, not to confirm extraordinary conclusions, but to admit the continued presence of observation without full explanation. In this environment, the Phoenix Lights feel less like an isolated anomaly and more like an early chapter in an ongoing negotiation between perception and certainty. What thousands of people experienced that night was not merely a visual event. It was a disruption of expectation, a moment in which technological confidence briefly gave way to shared ambiguity. Today, experiences are often mediated before they are even understood, recorded instantly, debated globally, compressed into headlines and timelines that leave little room for unresolved memory. But in March of 1997, uncertainty moved at the speed of conversation, neighbor to neighbor, witness to witness, city to city. No definitive conclusion emerged, only the quiet persistence of a question. Perhaps that is why the event continues to resonate, not because it proved anything extraordinary, but because it revealed something enduring about human awareness. We can monitor the skies, we can model trajectories, we can illuminate the night with networks of artificial light, and still, under certain conditions, an entire city can look upward together and realize that understanding is not always immediate. The Phoenix Lights did not change the world. They changed, briefly, the relationship between certainty and observation, and that relationship remains unresolved. This account remains open. If you were there that night, you are not alone in remembering it. For now, we'll leave the record here.